So as long as it's fair, as long as it's voluntary, inequality is fine. Inequality is great. We want those who succeed to be more rewarded than those who destroy value. But in the sense of our current environment, we have really sinister inequality.
If everybody, if the water's flowing and everyone is benefiting, right? Everyone's cup is filled. People are happy, right? They have better things to do than to line up outside of someone's house and threaten to chop their head off.
I don't think we should be setting up guillotines anywhere, and that's why I love Bitcoin. It's the peaceful revolution, right? But why do people want to set up these guillotines? Because they know the system isn't working.
It started to make a lot of sense to me that if we fixed money, we fixed so many problems in society. And so as a technology person, I was like, what should I be working on that's more important than this? There's nothing more important than this.
Welcome to the Tucson Bitcoin Podcast. Today I have on Pierre Rochard, who is a titan in the Bitcoin space. If you haven't heard of him yet, go over to Twitter and follow him because he does some really interesting stuff there. Recently, he brought up a concern with the Ethereum supply, which turned into this huge fiasco called Supply-Gate. And it was a lot of fun to watch from afar and to engage in some conversation around it on Twitter. But other than that, he's just a really, really interesting, smart guy, co-founder of the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. He's just got good content everywhere. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And we're recording. Welcome, Pierre.
Hey, Alex. Happy to be here.
It's good to have you. I'm really excited. I was actually, I had another accountant on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and I referenced you and called you the unofficial Bitcoin accountant. So,
yeah, although I'm technically not a CPA, so am I really an accountant?
yes.
Even though I've passed the exams. There are real accountants in the space, though. They mostly just do tax work, though.
Yeah. Well, for anybody that doesn't know who Pierre Rochard is, you need to follow him on Twitter because he's probably one of the best references for just good commentary on what's happening in the world. And you're really good at stirring the pot too, which I really appreciate. It can be entertaining sometimes. So you and some others were kind of the ones that started Supply-Gate recently, which was a really fun conversation that swept through Twitter and elsewhere. But yeah, so you have a background in Austrian economics. How did you get into Austrian economics?
Yeah, I was browsing Wikipedia, and the featured article that day happened to be about anarcho-capitalism. And so I clicked on it because it sounded, like an interesting topic, right? I was in high school. See, this was like the summer of my junior year in high school. And I started reading about it, and it struck me as being like the most rational explanation I've heard of how society ought to function. And I'd kind of gotten a comparative analysis already just by living in France and then living in the United States and living in France again, of seeing how completely different economic systems could be. And frankly, that there's just more wealth in the US than there is in France at this point. It seemed to me that like the further we go out in having more market and less government, that the better off everyone's going to be. And that anarcho-capitalism article, it must have linked to Mises.org at some point, either in a footnote or something. And I signed up for their newsletter. And so they had I think they still have a weekly newsletter. But at the time, it was like my sole source of, intelligent libertarian opinions on things or Austrian economics. And that newsletter, it talked about topics like global warming, right? And up until that point, I had only learned about these topics at public school. I hadn't really had any kind of other sorts of information other than that. I love my parents, but they didn't teach me, hey, global warming's a scam. Although I think today they would agree with that. And I remember even in like fourth grade, maybe even sooner, getting the whole rainforest talk of, hey, they're cutting down the rainforest, destroying the planet, and not really having any kind of ideas about why they might be partly right, but mostly wrong, and that was what the Mises newsletter, Mises.org newsletter had coming into my email every week. And then all the way to like topics like minimum wage, right? Where, oh, well, yeah, of course, minimum wage is a good idea, right? We should give people more money, especially when they're the least well off. And that to me was just like a no-brainer. And then I read this article, I think it was by Walter Block, where it was like, taking it apart from an economic perspective of how this destroys the job market at the, for people who are just getting started. And that the way you increase wages is by better productivity. So that was the first time I'd ever heard, that kind of argument, because in school they only teach you one side. And that was, that to me, I had a moment where I was like, oh, all of what's taught in school is not always correct. They do teach us incorrect things in school sometimes. And that was, I remember like having lots of cognitive dissonance over that of like, well, why would they do that? But it comes down to politics, right?
Sure. Man, stepping into the controversy right off the bat. So yeah, I mean, there definitely is a disconnect sometimes between what is taught in school and, how things actually work. So talking about minimum wage, that's a big topic, contentious topic, that a lot of people don't understand when they look at it, because they hear an argument against minimum wage and they hear, poor people don't deserve to get protected against inflation or, whatever. But there's a lot of nuance to it. And as I've been diving into this, I've been seeing that a lot of what is being talked about, like when you look at the classic Republican versus Democrat arguments, is that they're both built on faulty foundations. So
yeah, I mean, it's as simple as this. We have all of these judges that were appointed by Republicans who are, constitutionalists and whatnot, but they did not rule that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional, even though if you look at it should have been a constitutional amendment. It shouldn't have just been, the Federal Reserve Act, and so. It shows to me that ultimately, like, the state will optimize for size, right? They want to be as big as possible, and we see with the coronavirus thing as well. So it's bipartisan that on both sides. Well, all they argue about is, should we have more military or should we have more social welfare? That to me is the Republican Democrat divide, is how do we divvy up this pie? And guess what? In practice, it gets divvied up 50-50, right? Because that's how they fall, politically. It's always like almost 50-50, and people are wondering who's going to win the next election. And the reason it's always 50-50, it's not because there's like a fundamental, if you look at the population, everyone falls left to right, 50-50. It's part of the conditioning that people get in public school or on Nickelodeon. Frankly, Nickelodeon will not teach you about the Libertarian Party. And it's all so that they can maximize the size of the pie without competing factions trying to take pie from each other. And it's that way in a lot of countries, I think, but in the US, it's especially aggravated by, the design of the system from the get-go.
Yeah, it is a there's a lot of power going. I had a pretty contentious argument with my family yesterday about why I'm choosing not to vote this election, and they presented the argument that I could vote for a third party, and I told them that it's much more productive for me to buy Bitcoin than to vote because I'd much rather render this system kind of powerless or limit their power by actively doing something productive than to go and waste my time casting a vote for somebody that's completely shut out of the system, not given any fair news coverage. And, you know, it was a fun discussion, fun argument. So where do you stand on our current political system in regards to what the next 10 years are going to look like with elections and government actions?
Yeah, so I think that you know, it's a matter of corruption. So what has corrupted the United States is the fact that technology enabled paper money to work well enough. And you know, through the prevention of counterfeiting with, you know, advances in paper technology, especially, you know, right? So without that, I don't think paper money would last very long, because it ends up being counterfeited even by the non-issuers, right? And I think that's historically what has happened. And uniquely in the 20th century, we had the ability to make it uneconomical to counterfeit paper money. And, you know, that's a result of the Industrial Revolution and the advances in chemistry and all of this, where now you can verify a $100 bill pretty well. And, you know, they sell machines to allow you to verify $100 bills. And that's, you know, that's great for the government, but that's bad, because what it allowed was for the replacement of any semblance of having any constraints on the issuer's ability to print money with gold, right? And now the USD has replaced gold as the global reserve currency. And that has corrupted the US political system at its core. And it's kind of just a, you know, I think that there was one, you know, the biggest original sin in the United States was slavery. And then after that, let's say very far after that, just so I don't get canceled, is the second sin of fiat money. And that, I think it's a technological inevitability, right? That this, it was just going to happen this way, because you can't have hard cryptography and the internet before the, you know, the technology for paper to be verifiable. And that's just kind of a law, I guess, of history, right? I think that if we replayed history and kind of randomized the start map and all of this, I think the sequence of it would be the same. That you go from a precious metal, well, you know, you go from seashells and whatever, you know, Nick Szabo, et cetera, collectibles, to gold, to paper, and then to digital gold, right? Gold 2.0. And you have to go through the paper phase. Now, thankfully, that phase is coming to an end. And I think that when it does come to an end, the US will be able to restore kind of what it was from a political perspective in the 19th century, which is a laissez-faire, you know, decentralized, limited government, and especially at the federal level. Now, at the state level, yeah, sure, I think that we'll still have states that are very progressive and that, you know, have a lot of income redistribution and all of this. But I don't think that it will be the case at a federal level after Bitcoin takes over. We can put however many years we want on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the pinned tweet that you have on your Twitter account is Bitcoin is the next world reserve currency. What would be the benefits of having Bitcoin as a reserve currency?
So I would specify that I think that it's going to be a reserve currency for individuals. Maybe some corporations, as we've seen, you know, so far with MicroStrategy and Square. But ultimately, I think governments will be so late to the game that they won't really be able to use Bitcoin as a reserve currency. They're going to be living Bitcoin paycheck to Bitcoin paycheck, right? Of begging taxpayers for Bitcoin. And so I don't think that it will be a government reserve currency. I think it'll be a private reserve currency where, individuals and corporations hold large cash balances of Bitcoin. First of all, because they're incentivized to do so. They're incentivized to do so along a number of different axes. Bitcoin's fundamentals of being censorship resistant, seizure resistant, permissionless, and then that crucial fundamental of being, scarce at 21 million Bitcoin, where if you buy one Bitcoin, you own a certain percentage of the fully diluted supply, and that those make it such that it's a no-brainer to hold as much Bitcoin on your balance sheet as you can. And then the question will be, okay, what are some positive return on invested capital, positive NPV projects that we could pursue where we're going to make more Bitcoin, right? And I think that those actually will exist when Bitcoin reaches 100% adoption, because the upside, of Bitcoin will be much more limited than it is today when it's at 0.01 adoption. But at some point, everyone who wants to use Bitcoin as a reserve asset will be doing so, and at that point, I think that the returns on all sorts of different other investments will be more attractive than just holding Bitcoin. It's a long ways out.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they come into learning about Bitcoin, they get into it for the potential financial gains, and they come into it with high time preference. So they're looking for the Lambos or whatever, and the idea of like adoption being a slow progression. I mean, I've been in it since 2018, late 2017, and the level of adoption and growth I've seen since then has been mind-blowing, but it's still only a $250 billion asset comparatively to like other assets. So yeah, it is a really interesting take on it, and I think that's one of my favorite parts about Bitcoin is the way that it changes your time preference, like the way that these 4-year cycles work with the halvings. And I mean, it's a very, very different thing. So one of the things that, going back to the topic of schools, one of the things that isn't taught in schools is money. I think 9.5 out of 10 people, you ask them what money is and they wouldn't be able to give you any sort of clear definition. Why do you think there's such a disconnect between those first principles and education for normal people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's still a hotly debated issue in the field of monetary economics. And so I don't think that I haven't seen a definitive answer to the question, I'll be honest. I've seen pretty close things that I agree, a lot with, obviously from the Austrian school, but I don't think that anyone has actually answered the question. And I don't want to be so presumptuous as to say that I have an answer, because I don't. I have some ideas of what plausible definitions of money are, but I haven't found the perfect one, I'll be honest. And so to me, I almost have to refer to the external concept of saying, well, Bitcoin is money. That's really the best definition of what money is the Bitcoin system itself, and the units in it, and that there isn't really any other. It's almost like asking, well, what does the United States mean? Like what is its thing? It's like, well, it's borders. It's the actual geographic extent of this landmass. And it's, rather than trying to have an abstract concept of it,
Okay, that's a pretty pretty good take on it. So part of the reason why it's not taught, you're saying, is because it is kind of an abstract, subjective idea.
Well, sort of. I mean, I think that for it to be taught, these teachers would have to be or orange pilled. How many teachers are orange pilled? Very few.
Yeah.
And so if they were, then I think that it would be pretty easy to just say, hey, look, what money is Bitcoin, right? And you don't really, then we could talk about, okay, what are the properties of the system that make it money? But it's kind of just like a description of Bitcoin.
Sure. So going off of that, one of the narratives that's really floating around Bitcoin right now is that it's more of like a store of value and investment than a means of exchange. Do you see that changing in the near future?
Yeah, so I think that we have to get into the question of how does the market for monies work?
Okay.
And so, one way of thinking about money, which the Austrians are proponents of, and which I think is a really compelling, though not perfect way of looking at it, is the question of indirect exchange. So a money is something that in the course of trade that you're going to trade for without the intent of consuming it or of using it as an input for a production process, but rather because you're going to trade it again in the future. And so it's for a different good or service. And so that's what the indirect exchange means, right? Whereas direct exchange would be, 2 cows for your chickens, and both of us are going to eat them, right? I'm not taking chickens because I'm like, well, chickens are pretty liquid and I'm going to be able to trade these chickens for cigarettes and, work my way to the final good that I want. So there's indirect exchange. And I think that when you have a new asset, right, that is entering into this dynamic of the market for indirect exchange, right? And so today, the market for indirect exchange, it also includes real estate, right? Because there are people who buy real estate, not because they're going to live in it or because they're going to start a business using it, but because they think they're going to be able to resell it at a later point at a higher price. And so that's just due to inflation, right? People currently have to use non-monetary assets for indirect exchange, because using a monetary asset for indirect exchange only works if you anticipate your future exchange to be in the very short term, right? And so financial planners tell you don't hold more than 6 months worth of cash because of inflation. If you did not have inflation, financial planners would say, hold as many years of cash that you want, right? Because that's what you should do, objectively speaking, is that if you anticipate using cash in the future, right, in 10 years, then you should just hold the cash. You shouldn't go bet on the stock market, or go play in Vegas. You're going to need that cash in 10 years. And the best way to guarantee that you will have cash in the future is to hold it into the future. And so the argument of, is Bitcoin a medium of exchange or not, to me says, well, okay, if you are thinking about it purely from the perspective of someone who is exchanging in the short term, right, in the next 6 months, then no, I don't think it is, because people who hold Bitcoin are intending to exchange it in more than a year. If you look at the on-chain data of, hodlers, right, the hodl waves, there's just the majority of coins are being held longer than a year. Now, we can look at the data in different ways and try to exclude, some supply that might be lost or whatever. But I think the point remains that, there's not really a reason to have a view that short-term medium of exchange is more important than long-term medium of exchange. That's an arbitrary preference from the point of view of an economist. That's not a positive observation that one is better than the other. just as like I would say like, you know, light blue sweatshirts are better than light yellow sweatshirts. Like who gives an S, right? That's just going to be consumer preferences. And it's the same. It's the same with medium of exchange and using a good of you know, for indirect exchange, whether it's in 6 months or 10 years or 100 years. You know, the economists shouldn't care about that, and so thus it should not really have any impact on whether something is categorized as a money or not. And that the store of value functionality, first of all, I think it has two different definitions that are subtly different, but I would say one output always stores the amount of Satoshis that it stores, right? And so like, I think Bitcoin's the perfect store of value. Now, if we look at it from a volatility perspective, I don't really think that approach makes much sense either, because you can hedge the value, right? The price, sorry, you can hedge the price. So if you can hedge Bitcoin's purchasing power using derivatives, and there's liquid, you know, futures and options markets at this point on Bitcoin, then to say that it's a bad store of value, all that means is that your risk tolerance, first of all, is so low that you do need to hedge, and that the cost of the insurance contracts for hedging are too high for you. And so that excludes you from using Bitcoin for what you wanted to use it, right? For. And that to me is like, that's totally fine, right? There's lots of goods and services. For example, I would like to ride a rocket to Mars. The price of doing that is too high for me, right? And so then I can't ride a rocket to Mars. So I don't really see a reason why, you know, some people having terrible risk, you know, appetite is a reason to ding Bitcoin's definition as money, when there's clearly lots of other people who are willing to embrace that volatility because they get returns from it. And you can't predict what days the returns are going to be on, right? That's kind of the challenge of Bitcoin. And so thus it just makes sense to look at it long-term of, this is going to be a highly volatile asset, but the returns are very high. And so I'm going to hold it. And I think that, you know, people, there's also lots of people who are able to hedge, right? We see that in terms of the volumes on CME futures and whatnot. And there's also a lot of people who are able to self-insure. And so if you are cash flow positive, if you are earning money, you know, every 2 weeks, every month, you can not worry about having to liquidate your Bitcoin, right? And you can also have 1 year of fiat, you know, on your balance sheet if you're really worried about the volatility that much. I think that's irrational, because you can actually borrow against your Bitcoin, right? So if you have, and the chances are the unexpected cash flow that you're going to have is not going to be correlated with Bitcoin's price. So for example, let's say your car engine goes kaput. Why would that be correlated with Bitcoin's price, right? Odds are Bitcoin's price is going up, and so you can borrow dollars against it and then repay your loan later and be ahead, right? Because the amount of interest you paid is less than the gains on Bitcoin's price. And so it's good that you didn't liquidate. And really, you know, if you're cash flow positive and if you have a steady stream of income, then you can start being more aggressive about how you manage your cash, and you can hold more Bitcoin. But anyway, that's a tangent on kind of store value versus medium of exchange, because I frankly, like, I find the argument of like either, hey, it's only a store of value, right? To be kind of ridiculous, because you have to receive the Bitcoin. Someone has to send it to you in order for you to hold it. And so it has to be operating as a medium of exchange, right? And for it to be a store of value. And then for it to be a medium of exchange, you have to be holding it in order to spend it. And so thus it has to be a store of value in order for it to be a medium of exchange. So I kind of see it as there's this metaphor or like wise story from India or whatever of blind old men feeling an elephant and trying to figure out what they're touching, right? And so they're touching the tail and they're like, oh, this is a donkey. And then they're touching the tusk and they're like, oh, this is a rock. And they're touching the tongue and they're like, oh, okay, you know, this is a lizard or whatever. And so, you know, it's these are all different facets of the same thing, which is that money is a unit of account, money is a medium of exchange, and money is a store of value. And it is all of these things simultaneously to the same degree, I would argue. This whole idea of it's like it's going to evolve through these different phases, I think is an abuse of language, right? What people mean is that Bitcoin is going to have a phase where it is rapidly increasing in its liquidity, and it in that market for indirect exchanges, it is growing in its market share, right, very rapidly. And then at some point, it will have reached saturation, and adoption will have peaked, right, and reached 100%. And so all along, it was the same money, right? And I think that all of its properties were advancing at the same rate. I think that if you are orange pilled, you are using Bitcoin as your unit of account, right? And your store of value and your medium of exchange. If the person on the other side wants to receive Bitcoin, you can't use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange if the person on the other side doesn't want to receive Bitcoin. Unless they are auto dumping to an exchange or whatever, but that's kind of just a sleight of hand there. And so I think that that's where I like BTC Pay Server a lot. But in any case, all of these properties are evolving at the same time, and I think they're all increasing for Bitcoin. And where they're at is a proxy measure is kind of the 250-day moving average of Bitcoin's price. I think that gives you an idea of where Bitcoin's fundamental value as a money as a whole is.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot there. Yeah. I'm a big fan of the BTC Pay Server as well. So yeah, my orange pill moment really where the light switch kind of flipped from denominating everything in dollars to denominating everything in Bitcoin was when I was listening to a podcast of a guy that lives internationally. And he was talking about wanting to be in what he coined fiat shit coins for as little time as possible. One of the biggest advantages of Bitcoin as a universal currency and being borderless is that you can exchange it in and out of like any other currency if you need to. So though people don't want to, some people may not want to take Bitcoin, you could go somewhere and trade it with somebody or an exchange and then into the local currency. And that was like a major shift for me, especially like with all the reading that I was doing on where fiat currencies are going, which doesn't look too positive, but yeah. So yeah, have you looked into the IMF calling for a new Bretton Woods agreement at all?
No, I try to really not pay attention to what they're up to because I just see their tweets on Twitter and that's enough. They're ridiculous enough, people. And really like, to me, it would be like, historically there are situations where local currency just gets dominated by gold, right? And Safedine has written about these, where you might be on the silver standard and the silver just continuously devalues versus gold and you're pushed off of it. And so I think that like the people who were on the silver standard, they probably were trying to come up with all sorts of crafty solutions, right? Where they're trying to peg it or try to fix the price and engage in mercantilism and intervening in the market. And to me, all of those are just kind of a waste of time for them. And the faster that they would just embrace the superior money, the less pain they would experience, right? The faster that they just buy Bitcoin. And so to me, like I think that it's a pretty good idea that I'm happy to tune out anything that comes from them about CBDCs or New Bretton Woods, and only listen if they say we are adding Bitcoin to our balance sheet, right? That to me would be the only signal, and everything else is noise. And they will be wiped off of the face of the planet by hyper Bitcoinization if they don't, have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Now, what I do think will happen is that the employees who work at the IMF, they're going to own Bitcoin. And I think they're probably going to own Bitcoin before the average normie does, actually, because I think that they're doing research on this stuff, and they're smart enough to figure that they should at least have some skin in the game and some exposure to Bitcoin success. But the organizations themselves might end up without any Bitcoin. And so at that point, those people will just retire, and these organizations will just disappear. So it's not like there will be any continuity to them or any follow-up on them establishing a new monetary order when, they just go buy their citadels.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting takes, and I heard you talk about that in another interview. The personal incentive versus the government incentive, and how those two will clash, and that actually really eased some concerns that I had personally, because eventually there's going to be a point where we're already seeing it with like KYC, AML laws, and what happened with BitMax, and there is a coming and growing pushback against Bitcoin. But yeah, I feel like that's a safeguard in and of itself, because free markets never lose. You can try and slow it down, but they'll eventually win out. So yeah. So from like a societal issue standpoint, so I think there's really a growing attitude of like the importance of government and society to address certain issues. What issues societal issues does Bitcoin address?
Yeah, so I think that it's fundamentally about a concentration of power. And so power today is concentrated in, first of all, central banks, right, that have the power to issue the currency, but also by extension, commercial banks, which are kind of day-to-day creating money. And so I think that bankers as kind of a class, right, have had an outsized influence on all sorts of parts of society. They're influential politically, but they're also influential, I think, from an economic perspective, because they have all of this seigniorage at their fingertips. Now, I actually would question whether we can call it seigniorage, because the banking system is fairly competitive, even if it's pretty concentrated at this point. I still think it's competitive. And the proof of that is that we have pretty good mobile banking. If the banking system was not competitive, we would have terrible mobile banking, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's competitive on the other side of lending and borrowing, where earning net interest margin is not easy, and you are competing with a lot of other people who are also creating money. When we have financial crises, it's because they've run out of people that they wanted to. Oh, geez. Okay, sorry about that phone call there. Of people who want to borrow money, who are actually good for it, right? And so that concentration of power in the banking system, we can argue about that, because it is arguably pretty competitive. But nonetheless, as a percentage of the economy, we've seen that the financial system has significantly increased. And I think that, from commercial banking to investment banking to, the stock market and the bond market, all of these things, and frankly, also then by extension, private equity, hedge funds, VCs, all of these financial intermediaries, I think, have been subsidized by the creation of new money. And that absent that subsidy, they would be a much smaller part of the economy, and people holding cash and self-financing their own activities, right? Whether it's buying a house cash or buying a car with cash, would be able to, avoid paying all of this interest to these into the financial system. And so, yeah, I think the current financial system not only concentrates power, but like creates Ponzi-nomics all over the place. And it's also that you have to trust all of these other people. And we see it with like Enron and whatnot with these blowups, where I really think that if people could hold cash for the long term, right, and we're not pushed into investing in the public stock market or into bonds and whatnot, that the ownership of equities would actually primarily be about insiders. So, people who receive equity as compensation, or people who founded the business, if there's no VCs, then I think that the average founder would end up with a much larger percentage of their company, and the public float would be pretty small. And that would just be about creating liquidity for employees who are, are earning shares and being able to sell them in a marketplace, right? And the buyers might be other employees, right, who have insider information, and ultimately some retail guy who, like, they have no business owning the equity of a large corporation, right? Like, as a rule, that seems like it would be odd that would happen. I think it would be activist investors, and then professional investors, right? Portfolio managers who are looking for differences in relative value between different publicly traded companies. I don't really see a reason why the average American should own a private or a small percentage of a private corporation. That doesn't make any sense to me. What they should own is a large percentage of their own company, or of their own home, or of their own car, and a large cash balance, right, of an asset that is seizure resistant, censorship resistant, and actually scarce. And so it maintains its purchasing power and is incredibly liquid, right, that is tradable against every good or service in the world. And that's kind of where I think that if we get to that vision, then we dramatically reduce the power of finance and, by extension, the power of politics. Because, okay, we got the Federal Reserve, right? But the other part that we're missing is the nexus between the bond market and Congress deficit spending, where if the private borrowers, and commercial banks are a big part of this. Commercial banks own a large amount of U.S. treasuries, right? So commercial banks lend to the government. There's a symbiotic relationship there. And then commercial banks can influence the government. And we've seen this historically. I'm not arguing that this is currently happening right now, because I actually don't think it is, where commercial banks will not lend to a government or to a politician, right, based on political policy differences. And so they're able to use the ability to create money in order to influence the political system, and vice versa, right? Where the political system is able to influence commercial banks. And we see this, for example, some commercial banks are censoring marijuana dispensaries, or are censoring strip clubs, or are censoring adult stores, or are censoring, what's a right-wing thing? Firearms, gun stores, right? They get censored. And so I think that, by commercial banks, where you can't open an account there because you're deemed like a high political risk. And so this enmeshment between finance and politics, I think, creates a huge amount of concentrated power, where now everyone's fixated on who is going to be the next president, right? Because all of that power he has, or she has, in the case of Kamala Harris, who might be our next president, is tremendous, and same thing with Congress, where, and the way that the executive branch wields that power is through the Treasury Department, through OFAC, right? So they can put sanctions on you. They can put sanctions on anyone, now of foreigners, right? But domestically, they can put sanctions on you by, for example, the IRS went after Tea Party groups as a political strategy, right? Not for a public policy reason. And they were caught, and, it was a scandal under Obama, but I think that it just shows how we want government to be limited, not because we hate government, but because we know that government will get abused by whoever is in power.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the interviews I did recently with Sheila Weinberg from Truth in Accounting was pretty mind-blowing, as she just talked about how local governments, especially right now, are completely broke and are completely dependent on lenders for money because they're unable to raise taxes because it's so unpopular to fund their various. She used the city of Chicago, which I think is the blueprint for how not to run a government, but yeah, they're completely broken, and that's a huge amount of power that you as a government official are giving to the banks. And yeah, I mean, that I think that's one of the major concerns with the digital various government digital currencies is it allows them so much more power to just shut people out, and instead of having to go through these multiple steps to lean on payment processors or whatever, to like WikiLeaks, for example, the way that they leaned on Visa and PayPal and those guys to stop servicing them, and Bitcoin kept them alive, I think is a really interesting story in that regard. But yeah, so as far as like the normal person, so one of the things you talked about was like the idea of buying a house cash, or owning your own business. Those concepts are pretty hard to grasp, I think, right now, because the idea of like coming up with, in Tucson, houses range from like a nice house ranges from like $200,000 to $400,000, or more, obviously. But the idea of coming up with that much cash for the typical person just seems, pretty ludicrous. But when you have a form of money that isn't being debased constantly, it makes it possible. And yeah, what you described was really a really big difference to the current system that we have right now. So to address when you talk about limited government, what does a limited government look like?
Yeah, so I think that under the classical liberal view of a limited government, the first way that it is limited is that it doesn't have the ability to arbitrarily consume as many resources in the economy as it wants to. And one of the key ways it does that is by making sure that the representatives of the people, right, in a republic, are only able to spend what they tax, and that you don't have the ability to deficit spend. And so what that means is that any spending that happens means that you have to increase taxes, and that gives the people the opportunity to vote you out if they don't like the amount that you're taxing them, right? And so fundamentally, to me, a limited government isn't a small government or a large government. It is a government that is constrained in its size to the size that the people will allow it to be, right? And so that's the limitation to me is the people. And that's the limiting factor. It's not anything else, because ultimately I do think that if we look at different ways of assigning power, if we're gonna have a monopoly on violence, I actually disagree with Saifedean on this, and with Hans Hermann Hoppe. I've come around to the idea that we can have that actually a sovereign that has low time preference is not necessarily better than a sovereign with high time preference. Is the way I'm starting to analyze the situation. And that to the extent that a sovereign creates bads, having a high time preference sovereign sovereign will produce fewer bads than a low time preference one. And we can get into some specific examples, but fundamentally, I think that the reason that democracy has become so bad is because it has no longer been limited by the budget or by the tax, right? By the direct taxation. And the way that democracy becomes unlimited in its power is when it has seigniorage revenue, when it has the mint, when it has nationalized the creation of money and excluded all other competitors from the market, monopolized it, then it really shows its ugly face, right? Of, well, what is the ugly face of democracy? It's that of bread and circuses, right? Of the mob. That is the bad part of democracy. The good part of democracy is saying, hey, look, we want the people to choose the most virtuous person among us in order to do these collective actions, right? Whatever it may be, securing the border, or we want specific, for example, public libraries, and we want to coerce everyone into paying for it. Well, so I don't think we can stop the mob from doing that ultimately, right? I haven't seen any technologies which allow that so far. Perhaps, though, Bitcoin, by not only removing the seigniorage part of it, of removing the printing press from the hands of the mob, but also increasing the cost of taxation, where because Bitcoin is seizure resistant, that people are able to much more easily do what I call civil disobedience with regards to taxation, that not only are they able to express themselves at the ballot box, but they're also able to express themselves through illegal, civil disobedience, right? That's the whole point of civil disobedience, is that it is illegal. But ultimately, that it is legitimate in the sense of they are protesting a tax that is unconscionable, that really goes beyond what we should accept as a society, and that the mob has created a tax that is egregious and violates someone's natural rights. I think that that's a plausible argument, right? And I think that Bitcoin allows it actually makes it more expensive for the IRS to do its will. And if it's more expensive for the IRS to do its will, that means that the equilibrium amount of taxation is lower than it otherwise would be without the seizure resistance. So if it's as easy as just dinging your bank account, right, which is what's going on right now, garnishing your wages, then that means that we can have higher taxation. Now, the thing to note is that dollars in small amounts are not seizure resistant, right? So it's very easy for the IRS or for others to garnish your wages or to seize your bank account. Dollars in large amounts are more seizure resistant because you can pay for lawyers that create seizure resistance, right? And lawyers call this asset protection. So you can pay for asset protection. You can pay to create legal structures that are seizure resistant compared to what poor people have access to. And so that's actually a huge source of inequality in our commercial systems, is that rich people get richer because they are able to protect their assets better than poor people. And I think that, part of the explanation of inequality certainly is the printing press, right, since the 1970s. But I also think part of the story is about the legal system protecting the rich and failing to protect the poor quite often, where ultimately the poor are protected by their own tools. So what that means is the poor are protected by their guns rather than by the police system, right? If you live in a hard part of town, chances are you're better off owning a firearm than begging for the police to protect you, when in all likelihood the police might make things worse. And then, whereas if you live in a gated community with a private security guard, okay, you can own a gun, but chances are you'll never even have to use it, right? Because it's so well guarded that it's not a problem. And so Bitcoin actually reduces the cost of asset protection, where now you no longer have to depend on lawyers for asset protection. What you can depend on is the chain, right, of having a multi-sig, for example, and you could split up your multi-sig, in whatever way that allows you to be more seizure resistant with regards to criminals, with regards to accidental loss, right? So for example, crypto steel is more seizure resistant to fire than a pile of cash, right? Cash lights on fire, as we saw in the terrible burning of the money in the banana stand in Arrested Development, which really showed the lack of seizure resistance of physical cash. And that's something that I should comment on publicly. I don't think I've ever, this is an exclusive on your podcast right now, that I'm linking Arrested Development to Bitcoin seizure resistance.
Yeah, wow. That's a wormhole you just got into. So much to unpack in that. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that, so part of my podcast is really trying to give normal people tools to be empowered, and to kind of flip the script and get outside of the system. And the civil disobedience is something that I found. Have you seen the movie on Netflix, the Chicago 7 yet?
Not yet, no. The one I recently saw was about Rudy Giuliani dismantling the mob in New York City. And I don't have the name in front of me, but it was a fascinating documentary, especially when I was thinking about how it applies to Bitcoin, because essentially the reason that they were able to do this was because they were able to bug homes. So they were able to put recording devices in people's homes, and so they would get warrants to do this. I would question whether that whether hard cryptography can make that impossible, right? And today, and so essentially, will we see? And I'm not. I obviously I don't want to engage in mob like activities. And I'm opposed to the mob, although I consider the government to be thuggish and gangsterish with its shakedowns, and it's we could debate that. But all I'm saying is that if the technology makes people more resistant to and more private, right, and so more resistant to government snooping in on them, and so far it's done the opposite, right? Now, I'm sure it would actually. Like, it was very hard for Ross Ulbricht to run Dread Pirate Roberts, right? Let's not presume. I don't know who DPR is. He was able to do it using Tor, and these mobsters in the 80s and 90s didn't have Tor. So I wonder if with Tor and with private communication that we would have a different outcome in terms of the battle between Rudy Giuliani and the mobsters in New York. But that's, it's speculative, but maybe we'll see a resurgence of organized crime using cryptography. I've heard of cases of that happening. In Europe, there was an app that was actually, here's how the government took it down, which maybe is a counter argument to what I'm saying. They were able to get all of these gangsters using an encrypted app that was owned by the government. So it wasn't actually end-to-end encrypted. It was the man in the middle. And they were able to bust all these guys. And so it's gotten easier to bug these people. So maybe that's the future, is the government is scamming people into using quote unquote end-to-end encrypted chat. Which also, it kind of makes me wonder about Zcash and Monero, right? Where the IRS is putting a bounty on, breaking Monero's anonymity, and let's say that it's impossible, right? it's kind of an argument of, what do you think the odds are? Do you think the odds are that it's impossible, or do you think the odds are that it might be possible? And so from there, do you conduct your Monero transactions with the expectation of privacy or not? And so if you think that there is some percentage probability that the IRS will be able to break Monero's anonymity, wouldn't that be an argument to not use Monero, expecting it to be private, right? Expecting it to be 100% private. And I also would argue that it's the case today that you could use Bitcoin in a way that allows you to have some degree of privacy within some percentage, right, of probability. And then we can argue about which has a bigger percentage than the other. But at the end of the day, we're not talking about a binary, right, of is this a privacy coin or not, but rather of a spectrum of, is the way I'm going to use this asset going to be private or not, and by what probability? And that's kind of my thought there from watching this documentary about Rudy Giuliani and the mob.
Yeah. Another good piece on Rudy Giuliani is the new Borat movie. He had a short cameo.
Yeah, it's nowadays I would argue that you should just assume everything's a setup, right?
Mhm.
Even interviews like this, like I kind of go in assuming like something weird could happen, and I can just sign out, right, and move on. And like if someone asked me for an interview where it's like a New York Times reporter, I'm like, nah, not interested. I know it's a setup. There's no New York Times reporter that is reaching out for an interview with me, or Bloomberg reporter, or even Wall Street Journal reporter, where it's actually a good faith conversation or article that they're writing, or that it's going to be a positive article about Bitcoin. I just know it's not going to be that. And the only exception to that is Joe Weisenthal. And I have been on his podcast, Odd Lots. And sure enough, it was not an ambush. It was not a scam. So my judgment was correct. But I stand by that. And even like, so I won't name names. So that's kind of the default approach you should have to things. And so Rudy Giuliani, like, I guess he's been doing interviews for a long time, before the internet existed, before anyone could ask you for an interview, I guess. And he thinks he still has power, right, in today's day and age. I kind of think of it as like, the reason Donald Trump has power is because of his Twitter account, not because he's president. Right? And people think that, and I'll hear this about myself. People are like, oh, Pierre, Bitcoin's just like an echo chamber, and you're just like some loudmouth, right? Okay, true, but you could say the same about the current president of the United States. And I'm not saying that I have his power, right, or that I want to run for president or anything like that. I'm just saying that the ability to communicate to a large audience is power in 2020. And I think that Rudy Giuliani, in that regard, he has less power than Borat, than Sacha Cohen, or whatever his name is, Sacha Baron. I don't know.
Yeah, but Baron Cohen. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I got mixed up there. I was like, no, Baron is the son of Trump, and Cohen is, his attorney or something. But anyway, Sacha Baron Cohen has more power than Rudy Giuliani today because they have a bigger audience, and so anyway, I think Rudy it's time for him to just kind of retire, right? And anyone who falls for that kind of interview trap, or even Donald Trump fell for it, right? He fell for it with 60 Minutes, or he sat down with 60 Minutes. Screw 60 Minutes. Like, just talk with the American people by having a video and posting it on Twitter, right? And Trump's done that a lot. You can speak directly to people. You don't have to hold yourself hostage, or find friendly interviewers like yourself, right? Like, I know you're legit, like I can find lots of Bitcoin, orange-pilled people who will talk with me about Bitcoin. and not try to get me on a gotcha question about, you know, I don't know, COVID-19. Like, who cares?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like podcasting is one of the biggest growing sources that people use to gain information, because it's more of a discussion rather than a quick gotcha soundbite, and that's why I really enjoy it and felt like it was important to do something like this rather than more traditional settings. I mean, it's pretty wild the way that like information is being disrupted, and yeah, it's like Peter Schiff got ambushed by 60 Minutes recently too, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the mainstream media is just an extension of the state, right?
Mhm.
And we see that with like all the Go Vote stuff, all of their
Yeah.
censorship, you know, whether it's, and by the media, I don't mean the New York Times. I mean the New York Times and Facebook, right? And Twitter and Spotify and everyone, Google, right? All of these corporations, Apple, they're media corporations at this point. And that's why the New York Times attacks tech companies, because they're competitors. And and then calling themselves journalists, that's just a go-to-market strategy. That's just branding, right? That's not what they are. They're not journalists. Journalists are they have a completely different role. Journalists verify information. These are political actors, and they're extensions of the state, and they are driving at certain policy decisions, and they are manifestations of political power within different factions, right? Wall Street Journal being about establishment Republicans, New York Times being about establishment Democrats, and then you've got all of the kind of you know, power dynamics between Facebook and they, you know, Google is obviously an extension of the Democratic Party, right? Of Democrats. And when Obama was president, Google was deeply embedded in the executive branch and into the U.S., even Congress, right? Facebook, I think, has tried to be more centrist, right? And please both sides. Because ultimately Facebook wants to be its own sovereign. And I don't think that, you know, Google has that same ambition. But really, you know, if I say Facebook is a kind of a, Facebook at this point in my mind is a separatist organization. It's like, who are their separatists? Well, you know, in Spain, they have their own separatists, Catalonians. In the U.S., I think that Texans want to kind of go their own way, but you know, Texas independence, the movement for it, is much smaller and less powerful than Facebook independence and the movement for Facebook's independence. And we've seen Facebook influence not just in the United States, but like international policymaking. So yeah, it's interesting to think about it that way too.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the tech companies taking on roles that the state typically would have held is pretty crazy. I mean, Facebook Libra coin, having this, giving like a tech company that much control is different and weird. And you know, one of the ideas of like the state, like going back to topics that you covered, is that there's some accountability to the people. And a lot of these private institutions don't have that same accountability. And
well, so the reason they don't have that same accountability is because they were actually granted an immunity. That's what Section 230 is about. And basically, my thesis is that without Section 230, which gives them immunity about what their users say on their platform, these social media companies don't scale. Right? Because in order to scale, you would, without Section 230, you would have to be able to police what people are saying on your platform. So you would actually have to prevent people from saying things that are illegal. And we can debate about what should be illegal to say or not. The bottom line is that even the most fervent libertarian agrees that fraud is it violates the non-aggression principle, and that even in an anarcho-capitalist society, fraud would be punishable, right? And so you would be able to legitimately punish someone and transfer wealth from them in order to compensate a victim of fraud. And Section 230 removes that liability from the platform. And so people can use platforms like Twitter to commit fraud. And Twitter doesn't have to prevent that from happening, even if they know about it, even if they reasonably could prevent it from happening, because they're not held liable for it. And so this is a subsidy on them that allows them to scale. If they didn't have this subsidy, then they would get, they would have to pay a high cost, either in lawsuits, right, of getting sued for enabling fraud, or in having to moderate the platform. And so they would be very expensive to moderate the platform at scale. And so what I think we would have is far more competition between smaller social media platforms that are able to be far more targeted. And so I think that you would have much fewer like broad platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And instead you would have far more narrow niche platforms that are specifically targeted to interest groups, to ideological groups. You might have like, and you have this in the dating website realm, right? You have dating for Christians, dating for Jews, dating for atheists, dating for casual people, dating for people who want to get married, dating for people who are young, dating for people who are old. And so you have this natural fragmentation in the marketplace, which I think you would have in social media if you removed this broad liability protection. And you'd probably have even more fragmentation in the dating market as well if you removed that liability, because they too, I think, are protected by Section 230.
That's a really, really interesting take. And I would say I agree with it, and definitely is pushback against my previous thoughts on the president's threats of repealing that. Initially, my thought was like it would be a limitation of free speech, but the idea of
corporations shouldn't be forced to allow free speech.
Yeah.
Right. And so ultimately corporations are private property owners. And so if they own a supermarket, I don't think they should be forced to allow a protest in their parking lot. Right. Like the government should stay out of that. And if the supermarket does not want to allow protests in its parking lot because it gets in the way of their customers, then they should be allowed to evict those people, right? And charge them with trespassing. And it's not a violation of free speech, even if they are peaceful protesters. To me, they are not peaceful protesters, they are trespassers if the property owner doesn't want them to be there. Same thing with your driveway, right? And that's why I think roads should be privatized as well, and parks. But anyway, that's a side note. The Twitter servers, the Twitter servers, and the ISP's fiber optic connections are pieces of private property owned by private property owners who should be allowed to exclude people from their private property for any reason. And so Twitter should be allowed to exclude anyone from their server that they want to. And so that's where I think that they shouldn't be forced to mandate, or they shouldn't be forced into allowing free speech. It should be a voluntary corporate policy of theirs or not. It's kind of a product decision, right? Do you want to allow anyone to say anything on your platform? I don't think so, because ultimately your platform would just get filled with spam. So you're going to have to censor some people. And then it's like, all right, well, do we censor political speech? For some platforms, political speech might be spam, right? So if your platform is for people to discuss farming equipment, they are spamming your servers if they discuss politics, right? It's kind of like, okay, go your negative externality on the business, because this is a business about discussing farm equipment. So that's where I think it's perfectly valid for them to censor what their users can do. And I don't think the government should be involved in that decision at all. And that conversely, the government shouldn't be, as I mentioned, providing subsidies to platforms that do enforce free speech. Platforms that enforce free speech should compete on equal footing with platforms that aggressively censor. Because I don't think that there's a reason to think that one is better than the other. It's arbitrary. Where you draw the line of what free speech is, as a private property owner, specifically, is up to you. If someone came onto my property with a bullhorn, that's a violation of my property rights. I don't really care about their freedom of speech. That's on them to get their own piece of property to use their bullhorn on.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I got some thinking to do after this. Yeah, the ideas in around private property rights, I think, is really fundamental, and that's another issue that I think a lot of people don't have a clear understanding on, and why we have so many topics about like taxation and things like that, or minimum wage, or government intervention over economies. But when you line it out like that, it makes a lot of sense, and I think is a pretty sound argument. But yeah, what are some things that are like, things are about to potentially get pretty crazy here in a couple of days? What are some things that are giving you hope and like a bright outlook on the future?
I think that I don't know that things are going to get crazy. I kind of see it two different outcomes. One is Biden wins in his decisive victory, or it's a very close call and it goes to the Supreme Court. And I think that the Supreme Court ultimately is going to depend on what the lawsuit is that gets to the Supreme Court. And there's no way to predict that. So that's a coin toss. I actually, people think that because Trump now has, 5 out of 4 justices on the Supreme Court, or maybe even 6 out of 4, depending on how you look at it, the Supreme Court will side with him if it's 50-50. I don't think that's the case. I actually think that it really 100% depends on what the lawsuit is, and that the court would side with Joe Biden if that's what the law says they ought to do, based on the facts that they get in the lawsuit. And that's that would be an interesting outcome, because I think that would avoid the court packing thing, right? Where Joe Biden's like, the worst outcome possible would be for the Supreme Court to side with Trump and for Biden to win anyway through some other mechanism, right? I don't know. Because then that would undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and that would lead to court packing.
Yeah.
I ultimately, I think that U.S. institutions are pretty resilient, and predictions of them blowing up have always turned out to be entirely wrong. And they're pretty lindy at this point. So, I think that we could see riots and looting and violence, whatnot, and, but not worse than recent history, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good outlook on it. And I was listening to Alex Gladstein debate Saifedean, and that's kind of what he pointed to as well, and gave me a lot of hope, because there's just a lot of crazy energy out there right now. But yeah, where can people follow your work?
PierreRochard.com, or on Twitter at Pierre_Rochard.
And I think you have a podcast as well, right?
Noted Bitcoin podcast, although it's been a while since we've had an episode.
Awesome. Well, it was really fun having this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on. Great questions.
That was a really fun interview, and I really enjoyed it and appreciate Pierre's time. He's just really, really cool, smart dude, and I look forward to seeing what he does in the future, because he does have a really large impact on the world of Bitcoin, and if it's going to do what he says it's going to do, he will also have a very influential role in this world. If you like what I'm doing with the Tucson Bitcoin podcast, love your support. If you do the whole like, subscribe, comment, leave a review, do all that stuff. It really goes a long way to help get the message out there in the community. And the ultimate goal is to help people to use tools that better their lives and empower them, so we don't have to continuously see this just like abysmal state of poverty in our community, because it's not necessary, and we have tools today that were never accessible before, and it's really, really exciting. And it's why I do this work, because there's nothing more important than fixing our society and helping those that need help. So you can also support me on Patreon at Tucson Blockchain. And thanks for stopping by.